There is a place in our galaxy where the darkness is broken by a single drop of impossible blue. It hangs in the void like a whisper of ocean light, but there is no ocean there, no water, no clouds, no scattering atmosphere to paint it with color, and yet it shines. Deep, cold, certain, a blue that feels older than our world and strangely alive. The first time it appeared on the screens of the observatories, no one spoke. The room did not fill with questions or theories or excitement. It filled with a silence that felt almost instinctive, as if every person there understood that they were looking at something the rules of physics had not prepared them for. A world without water should not be blue. A world without an atmosphere should not glow. And a world so cold should not be bright at all. Yet there it was, a perfect impossibility, suspended in the dark. You are listening to Whispers of the Universe. If you are kind enough to leave a small light behind, even the faintest gesture helps this quiet place keep breathing. The first wonder of this strange world came from how it looked. At a distance, it resembled a sphere of glass filled with trapped light, as though a forgotten sea had been frozen into a jewel and set adrift through space. But the longer the astronomers studied it, the clearer it became that this was not a reflection. The light was not bouncing off the surface. It was leaking out, diffusing upward from beneath a shell that looked more like a crystal than rock. The planet did not behave like anything familiar. It did not gleam sharply the way ice does under a star. Its glow was soft, layered, like breath moving through a translucent shell. And in that breath-like shimmer, the researchers sensed a quiet invitation, as if the planet wanted to be observed. Or perhaps it had simply been waiting for eyes to land upon it again. And when the telescopes finally focused all their sensitivity upon this lonely sapphire of the void, the data began to say things no one was prepared to hear. The first reveals came quickly. Observatories on Earth confirmed that the planet held almost no atmosphere, too thin and too still to scatter starlight into blue. There was no water vapor, no methane, no familiar gases at all. The surface temperature was far below freezing, cold enough to lock most known materials into complete inertness. But then came the anomaly. Instruments measured an intense spike in reflectivity in the range associated with deep blue light. It did not match ice. It did not match frozen minerals. It did not match anything in the catalogs of planetary materials. Hubble confirmed it. The Keck Observatory confirmed it. And then, the James Webb Space Telescope repeated the same result, but with a detail that unsettled the entire team. Even the night hemisphere of the planet glowed faintly blue. A world without warmth was shining from within. It should not have been possible, yet the numbers did not bend. And, from that moment, every theory about its nature began to crumble. Because if the blue light did not come from sky, or water, or heat, then the only place left for it to come from was the planet itself. Not from its surface reflecting starlight, but from something buried deep under its crystalline skin. The conflict grew louder with each analysis. Blue requires scattering, but there was no atmosphere to scatter anything. High reflectivity requires ice or metallic surfaces, but the temperature was wrong for any known structure to remain stable. Emission requires energy, but the planet was colder than any place with enough activity to glow. By every rule, the world should have been dark, dead, silent. Some scientists argued the data was corrupted. Others insisted an unknown material was responsible. A few whispered that the planet might contain a state of matter not yet recognized. And beneath the debate was a heavier question, one that no one wanted to say aloud. What kind of birthplace could shape a world that behaves like this? For if this planet did not match the physics of its current environment, then perhaps it was not born here at all. Perhaps it was a survivor of something older, harsher, stranger. And so the researchers shifted their focus, no longer looking at it as a simple planet, but as something closer to a memory preserved in matter, a remnant sculpted by forces the modern universe no longer produces. a relic of an environment long vanished. From here, the mind drifts deeper. Imagine a crust made of mineral glass, compressed under pressures high enough to bend the structure of silica into patterns that trap light like old secrets. Imagine a surface so smooth it behaves like a lens, letting internal radiance shimmer outward in soft waves. Imagine a world where the ocean never existed, yet the memory of an ocean seems carved into the skin of rock itself. Perhaps once, this world held energy far beyond that of a star. Perhaps it cooled too quickly, locking its glowing interior in a crystalline tomb. Or perhaps it never cooled at all. Perhaps something inside continues to pulse, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of a forgotten era. The more the scientists observed, the more the planet began to feel less like a place and more like a story told in the language of matter. A story not about life, or water, or habitability, but about the earliest conditions of creation, about pressures that folded minerals into luminous states, about forces that shaped matter into forms we have never touched. The glow becomes an echo. The echo becomes a memory. The memory becomes a question. What if the blue we see is not color, but history? And as the telescopes gathered more data, as the models grew more complex and less comforting, the researchers turned to the next mystery waiting beneath that shimmering shell. For there was still something they had not yet examined. The surface was only the beginning, and, beneath it, the real secret was waiting. The closer the researchers looked, the more they realized that the shimmering blue glow was not simply light escaping from within. It was moving, not quickly, not in flickers or waves, but in a slow undulation that felt almost geological, as if the surface of the planet were breathing in patterns too subtle for the eye to catch on the first glance. The glow thickened at certain angles, thinned at others, settling into shapes that resembled currents beneath a sheet of translucent glass. What they were seeing was not water, but it behaved like something trying very gently to imitate the memory of water. High-resolution observations revealed textures across the planet's shell that did not look like rock. They were too smooth, too regular, too reflective. Under the delicate shift of starlight, the surface gleamed the way polished crystal does when light moves through it instead of across it. It felt less like a crust and more like a frozen sea made not of liquid, but of mineral glass compressed into clarity. When the James Webb instruments mapped the surface in finer detail, the results startled even the most cautious voices in the team. There were ridges stretching for thousands of miles, arranged in sweeping arcs that looked impossibly deliberate, as if some ancient tide had sculpted the planet into a quiet memory of movement. The arcs curved in patterns that suggested flow, yet nothing had flowed here for eons. If anything had ever flowed at all, the models grew stranger. The temperatures were far too low for a liquid layer. The pressure required to form such glassy expanses should have shattered the surface into shards, and yet the planet seemed to have preserved those shapes perfectly, without a single fracture large enough to indicate violent cooling. The conflict deepened. A surface like this should not exist in nature, not without intense heat, not without a thick, dynamic atmosphere, not without some mechanism to shape the material into such sweeping elegance. But this world was cold, still, thin, aired, and almost entirely silent. Some astronomers suggested that the surface had once been molten before cooling so rapidly that it locked itself into a state between liquid and solid, a hybrid glass that retained the imprint of motion without the motion itself. Others argued that no known process could cool a planetary surface so quickly without destroying the very patterns they were now observing. And beneath all the theories was a whisper of something deeper, something unspoken. What if the planet had never been molten in the first place? What if it had crystallized under pressures that belonged to another environment, another age, another star entirely? The drift of thought carried the researchers downward, beyond the surface and into the layers they could not yet see. The glass-like crust might only be the skin of something more intricate, After all, glass can form in many ways. It can melt and freeze. It can condense from vapor. It can be shocked into existence by sudden energy. And in violent regions of space, energy can do things that do not follow the rules of calmer skies. Slowly, gently, the idea began to take shape that the planet's outer shell might not be a natural crust at all, but the remains of a larger structure. Something that had been exposed when the original surface was stripped away by forces beyond the ordinary life of a star system. Imagine a world hit so hard that its entire outer mantle was peeled back, leaving behind a mineral ocean frozen in the instant of its exposure. Imagine light becoming trapped inside that ocean, bending and refracting through layers of compressed crystal, as though echoing the final moment of whatever violence had created it. The more they imagined, the more the planet stopped feeling like a place and started feeling like evidence, a relic of a catastrophe, a window into a past that did not belong to the star it now orbited. And as their instruments pushed deeper into the readings, they discovered a thermal anomaly beneath the crystalline shell, a region where the temperatures rose in gradients even to be volcanic and too stable to be random. There was something warm beneath the cold glass, something structured, something waiting to be understood. The researchers leaned in, breath quiet, instruments humming softly like distant wind, ready to look beneath the shimmering crust for the very first time. Because the surface was only a surface, and under that layer of impossible blue, another mystery was beginning to reveal itself. The warmth beneath the crystalline shell should not have been there. Not on a world this cold, not on a world this still. Yet the thermal maps were unmistakable. A slow gradient of heat rose from somewhere deep below, spreading outward in soft, symmetrical rings, like a ripple that had never stopped traveling through the planet's interior. At first, the team suspected volcanic activity, but volcanic heat is violent. It claws upward in chaotic bursts. It leaves fractures, vents, scars. This heat was different. It was gentle, steady, almost patient, as if the planet had been storing it for a very long time and was now allowing it to drift outward in the quietest way it could. The more the readings came in, the deeper the confusion grew. With almost no atmosphere to trap warmth, any internal heat should have escaped into space long ago. Yet the glow beneath the crust was as consistent as a heartbeat. Not bright, not loud, but persistent, like a reminder of something unfinished. The researchers began examining the thermal signature more closely. They discovered that the warmest regions were not near the equator, as one would expect from a planet receiving light from a nearby star. Instead, the warmth pooled along vast bands beneath the night side, where no starlight touched at all. These bands curved in long arcs, following a pattern that echoed the crystalline ridges on the surface, like two layers of the planet humming the same quiet melody. Then a stranger detail emerged. The temperature along those arcs fluctuated in intervals too regular to be natural cooling. They rose and fell by the smallest degree, in the smallest rhythm, repeating over and over with a steadiness that made the scientists fall silent once more. Because a cycle that perfect did not belong to random geology. It belonged to something structured, something coordinated. A world without an atmosphere should have bled its heat into the void in the early ages of its life. A world without convection should not have any internal energy left. And yet this planet was holding a pulse deep beneath its skin, a pulse that refused to fade. It was a contradiction that made every model collapse. A cold crust over a warming interior suggested active processes, but the absence of fractures or magma signatures suggested the opposite. It behaved neither like a living planet nor a dead one. It hovered in a space between states, as if trapped on the edge of two realities at once. Some hypothesized that the heat came from radioactive decay, but the stable pattern did not match any known decay chain. Others suggested tidal heating, but there was no large object nearby to pull such tides. And beneath all the explanations lay a quiet discomfort. Something about the rhythm of the heat felt intentional, not artificial, but ancient, as though it had been imprinted into the planet long before it arrived in its current orbit. The drift of thought brought them back to the surface patterns. The arcs on the crust and the arcs in the thermal map matched too closely to be coincidence. They curved the same way, aligned the same way, and faded at the same points. It was as if the warmth was retracing the ghost of a motion the planet itself no longer remembered. This led to an unsettling idea. Perhaps what lay beneath the crystalline shell was not a core in the traditional sense, but a remnant of something once molten, once dynamic, once alive with thermal motion, a remnant frozen mid-movement, a thermal echo trapped under layers of mineral glass, repeating the pattern of a flow that had ceased ages ago. The more they studied it, the more the planet began to resemble a frozen moment in time. A world caught in the aftermath of an event so abrupt that it had locked every internal motion into a looping memory. The warmth beneath the crust was not heat from the present, but heat from the past that had never been allowed to fade. And as the thermal models deepened, as the gentle cycle repeated itself with impossible precision, the researchers realized something that pushed their curiosity even further. Where there is trapped heat, there is trapped motion. Where there is trapped motion, there is trapped structure. And where there is trapped structure, there may be layers they had not yet imagined. The instruments began scanning deeper. The pulses grew clearer, and beneath the warmth, something even more mysterious was waiting. A pattern was forming, and it was beginning to look like the planet had a memory far older than its star. The deeper the scans reached, the stranger the rhythms became. What had first appeared to be gentle waves of trapped heat began to resolve into something more intricate. The pulses were not uniform, not perfectly circular, not the simple echoes of a cooling world. They were shaped, layered, patterned in overlapping curves that resembled the slow spirals found in magnetic fields, though nothing on the planet suggested the presence of a field strong enough to carve such forms. As the models sharpened, a quiet realization slipped through the research teams. The warmth beneath the crystalline shell was not drifting upward at random. It was following paths, long, looping paths that curved through the planet's interior, as if guided by channels carved deep within the mineral layers. These channels were too smooth, too consistent, and too elegantly aligned to be cracks or fractures. They resembled conduits, and yet conduits for what? There was no molten core, no internal engine, no magnetic dynamo turning in the dark, but something was moving, even if that movement had been reduced to memory. When the thermal imaging overlaid with the reflective data from the outer shell, a subtle harmony emerged between surface and depth. The blue shimmer of the crust brightened faintly above the warmest interior arcs, as though the planet were exhaling from within, its inner glow pushing gently through the thick, glass-like layers. Every rise in temperature caused a soft deepening of color across the surface, barely noticeable unless viewed over many rotations. It was a whisper of motion in a world that should have been utterly still. This alignment raised a troubling contradiction. If the heat was simply a relic of an ancient past, it should not still be redistributing itself. Remnant warmth fades. It does not choose paths. It does not follow memory lines. And yet these thermal currents were too neatly ordered for coincidence. They seemed to swirl slowly around a central point deep below, as though circling something at the heart of the planet. The deeper they looked, the more the impossibility sharpened. There was no sign of convection, no liquid layer to transport heat, no fluid dynamics at all. And still the warmth traveled its looping circuits faithfully, like echoes folding through a chamber long after the original sound had vanished. It was then that one researcher quietly compared the pattern to something rarely seen outside of laboratory simulations: a frozen, magnetic song, a resonance imprinted not in metal, but in mineral, a silent memory of a field that had once existed long ago. If the planet had once possessed a powerful magnetic core, strong enough to sculpt the internal crystals into spiraling paths, then the remnants of that structure might still guide the faint heat trapped within, not because the core was active, but because the shape it left behind remained. Silence fell across the room when this idea settled. Not fear, not awe, something deeper, something that felt almost respectful. They were not observing geology. They were observing after-geology, a world shaped by a force that had long since died, but whose signature lingered in the very bones of the planet. The conflict returned in full force. A core capable of generating such a field would require immense heat and motion, but the interior now was nearly motionless, its temperature barely above the cold of space. It was as if the core had been active at one moment and then halted instantly, frozen into stillness before its currents could fade away. No known cosmic event could freeze a planetary core so quickly, not without destroying the structure, not without leaving chaos in its wake. But this planet was pristine. The arcs, the spirals, the glowing pathways, everything was preserved with a delicacy that felt almost deliberate, which raised a far more unsettling question. What kind of event stops a world mid-pulse? The drift of thought deepened further. Perhaps the planet had not cooled naturally. Perhaps it had been caught in the wake of an external force so intense that it locked the entire interior into a static echo of its former self. A force strong enough to extinguish the planetary dynamo in an instant, yet gentle enough to leave the crystalline shell intact. A collapsing star, a shockwave from a dying system, the fading breath of a supernova. If a world had been close enough to such a catastrophe, its core could be extinguished as if a hand had pressed against it, silencing its magnetic roar forever. And the spiraling channels of heat, the crystalline memory lines, the faint internal glow might all be relics of that moment. But this led to yet another mystery. If such an event had occurred, why did the planet survive at all? And why did the remnants of its lost internal fire still circle something at its center, as though guarding it? The scans pressed deeper, the resonance lines grew clearer, the spirals tightened. Something was down there. Something the planet had wrapped itself around and kept silent for ages. And as the image of that central region began to form, the researchers understood that the next layer would not be easier to explain. The crust had been strange, the heat had been stranger, but the heart of the planet, that was about to rewrite everything, the heart of the planet emerged slowly from the noise, like a shape rising beneath deep water. At first it appeared as a blurred knot of warmth, a faint region just slightly brighter than the layers above it. But as more scans accumulated, the knot sharpened into a structure that none of the researchers expected. It was too symmetrical, not perfectly, not with the crisp geometry of engineered objects, but with a natural order that suggested a kind of internal architecture. A cluster of dense mineral formations arranged in a way that spiraled inward, almost like petals of a flower turned to stone. Each petal showed a slightly different thermal signature, yet all of them curved toward the same core, as though drawn by a force that no longer existed. There was no reason for a planet without a magnetic field to have such shapes. No reason for a frozen core to hold any structure at all. And yet the shapes were there, solid enough for the instruments to outline, delicate enough to feel almost fragile. But something else was missing. There was no measurable magnetic field, not even the faint whimper that most dead planets still whisper into space. The silence was absolute. The absence of magnetism puzzled the team. More than any shape or glow, even a planet with a cooled core usually retains a faint magnetic memory, a remnant of its ancient dynamo. But this world had none. It was as though the magnetic history had been erased, wiped clean so thoroughly that only the patterns etched into the minerals remained as evidence of what once lived at its center. The contradiction only grew sharper the more they studied it. A core shaped by magnetic spirals should not be entirely silent. A body that once carried such ferocity should not fall into perfect stillness. Something immense must have intervened, something strong enough to collapse the dynamo as if extinguishing a flame. But how does a world lose its magnetic voice without losing itself? The researchers examined the crystalline petals again. Their arrangement was too orderly for random cooling, and too graceful for catastrophic damage. Each curve aligned with the thermal channels above it, as if the entire planet had been shaped from the inside outward in one coherent gesture. It resembled the preserved trace of movement, motion captured and frozen in its last moment, a memory of direction, a memory of flow, a memory of something turning, winding, folding deep under the crust. The idea took shape quietly in the room. The planet was not silent because it had never had a magnetic core. It was silent because its magnetic core had been stopped, abruptly, instantly, without transition. Something had seized the heart of the planet and stilled it before the spirals could collapse into chaos. The structure held its perfect order as if the world had been caught in the closing moment of an unseen hand. The drift of thought darkened. If a dying star or shockwave had extinguished the dynamo, the interior would show scars, cracks, distortions, fractures. But there were none. The spirals were intact, every curve smooth, every line preserved. Whatever halted the core had done so without violence. The absence of destruction was almost more terrifying than destruction would have been, because it meant the force that touched the planet had precision, not blades, not fire, not collision, but a quiet pressure that could still the turning of a world without breaking it. Some began to wonder if the planet had not been stopped by a natural event at all, but by an environment so extreme that its influence passed through matter like a whisper of gravity, freezing everything in place before any reaction could begin. Others whispered another possibility. What if the spiraling core was not the result of movement, but the result of being held? What if the shapes preserved in stone were not what the planet had done, but what had been done to it? The idea hung in the air, like dust in dim light, delicate and dangerous. And as the instruments reached deeper still, the picture of that silent heart gained another layer of complexity. Underground reflectivity spiked. There were regions that did not respond, like mineral or metal. Regions that absorbed the scans almost hungrily, as if drawing in the probing light rather than repelling it. These zones formed a ring around the very center of the core, a place so dark in the readings that even the most sensitive instruments could not pierce it. The spiral petals surrounded a shadow wrapped in perfect symmetry, a shadow colder than the crust and yet more alive than the glow beneath it. The data came in slowly, cautiously, and with every frame, the shadow in the center grew sharper, deeper, heavier. It pulled at the imagination, the way deep water pulls at gravity. Something was there. Something the planet had sealed, or sheltered, or simply never let go. And whatever it was, the researchers would need to go deeper still to understand it, because the heart of the world was only beginning to show its true shape, and the silence at its center was waiting to be heard. The shadow at the center of the silent core lingered on the screens like a wound in the data, a place where every signal seemed to fall inward and disappear. It absorbed light, vibration, and even the faint thermal echoes that traced the spiraling petals of the mineral heart. No matter how many scans the researchers attempted, the darkness remained unbroken, untouched, as though it existed in a silence deeper than the silence of the planet itself. At first, they suspected an error, a void caused by interference or a flaw in the imaging process. But the more they adjusted the instruments, the more the shadow revealed its consistency. It was not a glitch. It was a feature, a region of matter, or perhaps the absence of matter, that responded to nothing the way a core should. The silence around it deepened into a kind of awe. It was not merely dark. It was intentional, shaped, enclosed. The team began comparing the data to models of collapsed planetary cores, objects whose centers had crystallized under unimaginable pressure. But nothing matched. Collapsed cores were dense, reflective, and brutally bright under scan. This shadow was the opposite. It was neither reflective nor transparent. It was neither metallic nor mineral. It was simply withheld. And the way it sat within the spiraling petals made the entire structure feel like a shrine. The outer layers, shaped in graceful arcs, pointed toward the shadow like rings of frozen motion drawn inward. The thermal channels circled around it, as though afraid to touch its boundary. Even the faint glow beneath the crystalline shell seemed to pulse in harmony with the space around the darkness. The conflict tightened around a single realization. The planet had not merely lost its magnetic core, it had lost something else. Or perhaps it had hidden something. The faint warmth that still flowed through the spiraling arcs seemed to protect the shadow, keeping it insulated in a cocoon of near absolute stillness. It was as if the planet had wrapped itself around the darkness, sealing it beneath layers of glass-like mineral and silenced stone. But the silence did not feel like death. It felt like caution, like preservation. As the researchers studied the thermal map further, they noticed that the temperature gradient around the shadow was impossibly even. Heat bent around it in smooth, uninterrupted curves, refusing to cross into the central region. The boundary was not a wall, it was a decision, a refusal of motion, of energy, of interaction. Nothing went in, nothing came out. The planet moved around it the way a tide moves around a rock left on the shore. The drifting thought grew heavier. To produce such symmetry, such absolute isolation, without destroying the surrounding structures, something had to freeze the core in an instant, so complete that the minerals never collapsed. A cooling so immediate that the heart could not shatter. A pressure so precise that it left the spirals intact. The shadow was the epicenter of that event, the moment in which the world stopped. And as they traced the lines outward, the researchers noticed something else. The spirals did not radiate from the shadow. They curved around it, as though it had always been there, as though the planet had formed around the darkness rather than the darkness forming inside the planet. This interpretation changed everything. It meant the planet might not have been born from dust and gas in the usual dance of accretion. It might have condensed around the shadow, every layer, every crystal, every shimmering arc a response to some unseen presence at the center. The implications rippled through the team like a cold wind. What kind of object could anchor a planetary body? What kind of seed could cause matter to gather and crystallize in these spiraling patterns? What force could inspire such structured stillness? The closer they looked, the clearer the patterns became. The shadow was not random. It was the quiet center of the world, the first thing the planet ever knew, the last thing it would ever protect. A gravitational whisper so faint that the crust barely acknowledged it, yet so enduring that its influence shaped the entire mineral heart. The instruments strained to see further, but the darkness remained untouched. It swallowed every signal without aggression, without warning, without response. A hidden origin, a silent core, a seed of something older than the star it now circled. And as the data settled into its final form, as the spirals mapped themselves into a story written in trapped motion, the researchers felt the next question rising, heavy and irresistible. If the planet had formed around the shadow, then what lay beyond the shadow? To answer that, they would need to trace the planet's history backward, not through matter, but through time, through the echoes of the events that had sculpted the world into the crystalline sphere now drifting in the dark. Because a silent core is only silent if something louder once came before it. And the universe has many ways of leaving scars that do not look like scars at all. The search for the planet's past began with its star, for every world carries the fingerprints of the light that shaped it. Yet when the researchers studied the star that now held the crystalline sphere in orbit, they felt the same quiet confusion that had surrounded the planet itself. The star was steady, mild, and unremarkable, shedding a gentle warmth into the void like any ordinary sun. Nothing about it suggested violence. Nothing hinted at a past capable of sculpting a world of frozen spirals and silent cores. But as they examined the starlight more closely, subtle irregularities emerged. The brightness of the star flickered in a way almost too slow to notice, a faint dimming that did not match the stable rhythm expected of its type. It was not dramatic, not chaotic, just an uneven breath, as though the star were sighing in intervals too long for the human mind to grasp naturally. When they modeled the star's internal structure, the irregularity sharpened. The pulse of the star's fusion layers did not follow the expected pattern. Certain wavelengths lagged behind others by margins so slim they were nearly invisible. Yet slim was not impossible. And the further the team pushed the models, the more the evidence began to whisper a troubling story. This star was not the first star the planet had known. It behaved like a star that had been disturbed in its youth, not shattered, not torn apart, but nudged, tilted, nudged again. Its internal equilibrium shifted by an event too fleeting to leave obvious scars. It was the kind of disruption caused not by planetary migration or magnetic storms, but by the shock wave of something immense passing nearby. A dying giant, a collapsing sun, a supernova whose breath brushed across space, like the hand of a ghost. A shock wave does not need to strike a star directly to change its life. Sometimes, proximity is enough. Sometimes, the memory of such an encounter lingers like a tremor that never quite fades. The team compared the star's spectral signature to historical models of post-shock stellar behavior, and the match, though faint, was unmistakable. A subtle distortion in the ratios of certain elements suggested enrichment from external material, not from planets evaporated or swallowed, but from dust cast across the cosmos by an ancient explosion. That was when the pieces began to align. If this star had once drifted through the aftermath of a supernova, the crystalline planet might have drifted with it, carried along by gravity, or captured as the system reassembled itself. A survivor of a shattered environment, swept into the orbit of a quieter sun long after its birth. This explained the star's irregular cycle. It explained the slight asymmetries in its light. It explained why the planet looked older than the system that held it now, but it did not explain why the planet was still glowing. A world carved by a supernova should be ruined, stripped bare, melted, fractured. It should bear the scars of chaos, not the polished patience of spiraling mineral petals. The crystalline shell should have cracked under the force of stellar death, yet the planet seemed to have protected its core, shaping itself around the shadow, preserving the silent memory of heat and motion even as the universe around it shifted. The drift carried the research team into deeper speculation. Perhaps the planet had not always been crystalline. Perhaps it had been molten once, sculpted by the intense radiation of a dying star, its minerals forced into new shapes as they cooled at impossible speeds. A world caught in the passing breath of destruction, crystallizing not through natural progression but through the sudden absence of energy, frozen not over centuries, but in an instant, too quick for matter to resist. The star's faint irregularities became a quiet confirmation of that story. It had been close to something powerful enough to change the lives of anything within its reach, even a planet. And as the researchers mapped the star's past trajectory through space, tracing its path backward along the currents of galactic motion, they began to uncover signs that the system had traveled through dense clouds of supernova remnants. The starlight passing through these regions revealed fingerprints of old cosmic dust, dust enriched with isotopes seen only in the wakes of stellar death. The evidence pressed gently toward a single possibility. The crystalline planet was not merely shaped by an ancient catastrophe. It was born of it, a remnant, a fragment, a survivor of a world that once orbited a star that no longer existed. The team grew quiet as the implications settled. The planet was older than the sun it now circled, older than the system that held it, older perhaps than many of the worlds in the sky. And if it had once been part of a different star, then the clues to its true origin did not lie within its current orbit, but in the path it had traveled to reach this quiet place. A pathway carved through ancient dust, a trail shaped by the breath of a dying sun, a journey recorded not in light, but in the structure of the planet's own frozen core. And somewhere along that journey, the world had gathered its impossible blue. To understand why, the researchers would need to follow that trail further into the deeper remnants of the supernova that shaped it, into the history sealed inside the minerals, into the echoes encoded in the spiraling stone. The next layer of truth waited not in the star of today, but in the ghost of the star that came before. The trail of ancient dust that marked the planet's passage through space was faint, but it was there, suspended like a thin thread woven through the dark. As the researchers traced the stellar system's motion backward along the arcs of galactic drift, they discovered that the world had not always followed its current orbit. Its path curved through regions where gravity was fragmented, where the debris of long collapsed stars still floated as shimmering grains of memory. It was among those remnants that the first real clue appeared. In the spectral aftermath of one ancient shockwave, long since cooled into a fragile mist of elements, there existed a distortion. It was not a typical gravitational ripple, nor the echo of a heavy object passing through. It was something subtler, a bend in the surrounding dust that suggested a body of considerable mass had once cut through the region, a body that moved with a steadiness planets do not naturally maintain when freed from their home star. The pattern of the distortion matched the trajectory of the crystalline world almost perfectly. Not a collision, not a chance encounter, a passage, a migration. The planet had glided through the remains of the supernova like a stone sweeping through a field of ash, leaving a narrow channel of disturbed particles in its wake. And along that channel, the dust exhibited unusual signatures, minerals reshaped, isotopes annealed by temperatures far too low for natural reformation, as if the planet had carried its own fever through the ruins. What kind of world carries its own temperature signature across light years? The deeper they looked, the stranger the data grew. The dust along the path contained minerals fused in patterns found only in environments of intense radiation. Yet there were no surviving stars in that region bright enough to account for it. The only plausible source was the planet itself, still warm from whatever catastrophe had shaped its crystalline heart. The researchers realized then that the warmth beneath the planet's surface was not merely a remnant. It was a memory of a time when the world had endured heat beyond anything seen in its present orbit. A heat powerful enough to melt minerals into glass, powerful enough to carve spirals into the core, powerful enough to drive the planet across space like a drifting ember. If the planet had once been cast outward by the explosion of its original star, then the path it took through the galaxy was not random. It was guided by momentum, by gravity, by the debris fields of stellar death. And the dust along that path kept the story alive. Mapping the mineral signatures revealed sections of the trail where the planet must have slowed, drawn into temporary relationships with other bodies before slipping free again. Regions where gravitational tides tugged at it, reshaping its course in small, delicate increments, as though the galaxy itself were trying to cradle the shattered relic, but failing to hold it for long. Each bend in the path brought the planet into contact with new clouds of enriched dust, new remnants of stars that had died across different epochs. The crystalline shell absorbed traces of these elements, incorporating them into its glass-like body. Layer by layer, the planet became an archive of stellar ghosts, a wandering museum of cosmic endings, and yet through all its drifting, it had preserved the shadow at its center, the silent heart that predated its journey, the core that seemed to anchor its identity even as everything around it changed. The researchers studied the orbit it now followed around its present star. The path was irregular in a way that felt almost tired, like a leaf finally caught in a gentle eddy after a long voyage through rough water. The orbit wobbled slightly, a residual tremor from its ancient travels, This irregularity revealed something profound. The planet had not been captured recently. It had settled into this system long ago, so long that its crystalline layers had adjusted to the mild warmth of a younger, quieter sun. But the internal glow had never vanished, never cooled into true stillness. The world had carried its inner fire with it, protected by the minerals that encased it, like a shell forged from catastrophe. The drift of thought circled back to the shadow in the core. If the planet had traveled through so many remnants of stellar death without losing that darkness, then the shadow was not a weakness. It was an anchor, a seed, a presence older than the explosion that had torn the world from its original star. And if the shadow had survived the collapse of one star and the drifting across the remains of others, then it might hold the only true record of the world's beginning. The team felt the weight of that realization settle into their minds, like dusk settling into a quiet valley. To understand the planet's impossible blue, they would need to look deeper into the material it had gathered on its journey. The dust fused into the crust, the elements embedded in the spirals, the signatures imprinted into the glass-like skin, because the clues were no longer in the star behind it or the star before it. They were etched into the world itself. And the next step was to peel back those glassy layers and read the history trapped inside them, layer by crystalline layer. For the planet was not just a traveler, it was a witness. And the story it carried was far from complete. The glass-like crust of the wandering planet held more than shimmering beauty. It held layers, thin and delicate, arranged with the precision of pages in a book that had never been meant to be read by human eyes. Each layer carried a slightly different tone of blue, a slightly different density, a slightly different response to the faint warmth rising from within. When the researchers began to analyze these layers, they found something that caught their breath in a quiet, collective pause. The layers were not uniform. They were stratified, not by age, not by weather, not by geological processes, for the planet had none of the familiar engines of change. Instead, the layers were divided by composition, by trace elements absorbed during the planet's long journey through the galactic remnants of ancient stars. Each stratum was like a chapter. Each chapter spoke of a place the world had passed through, and the deeper the researchers looked, the more vivid the history became. Near the surface, the crust contained dust from the region where the planet had been captured by its current star, a mild composition, gentle and ordinary. Beneath that, the minerals thickened with elements associated with the outskirts of an older stellar nursery the planet must have drifted through long ago. Further down, the glass became denser, darker, infused with atoms forged in the breath of a supernova. But then, at a depth far greater than expected, they found something else, a layer that did not match any known remnants of stellar birth or death. A layer so dense and so pure in its crystalline order that it refracted the probing light into spirals that mirrored the inner structures of the planet's silent core. This layer was unlike anything seen before. The team magnified the readings again, and again, and again, until the clarity settled into something unmistakable. The crystals in this layer were not layered by nature. They were aligned, oriented, pressed into place by forces that left no cracks, no fractures, no impurities, as if the material had been shaped in an environment where pressure flowed like wind, soft but absolute. The conflict sharpened in their minds. No natural process could create such symmetry in such conditions. Not cooling, not compression, not gravitational settling. The crystalline alignment suggested a moment in the planet's past when the surrounding environment had been so violent that matter had no choice but to obey. Not through destruction, but through overwhelming influence. A moment of pressure without contact. A moment of heat without flame. A moment of force without collision. Something powerful enough to sculpt the material into near-perfect order. As they drifted through the implications, a new thought rose slowly between them. Perhaps this layer did not tell the story of the planet's death, but the story of its birth. Perhaps the planet was not shattered by a star's explosion. Perhaps it was forged by it, as if the world had condensed out of the collapsing envelope of a dying sun, shaped in the final exhalation of stellar life. A supernova can destroy, but it can also create. It can crush matter into states that exist nowhere else. It can freeze motion so quickly that even chaos becomes order. The researchers examined the alignment again, watching the internal spirals dance across the display. The patterns did not resemble geological structures. They resembled a memory of the forces that shaped the world into the impossible blue sphere it had become. And the memory spoke softly of pressure beyond comprehension, of light intense enough to melt atoms together, of cooling so abrupt that minerals froze in mid-flow, a world caught in the stillness of stellar death. The drift of thought deepened when they reached the layers closest to the mysterious shadow at the center. These inner strata were darker, thicker, and strangely resonant, responding faintly to the background hum of the star, now warming the planet from afar. It was as if the inner layers still remembered the pressure that had shaped them, humming in sympathy to echoes of energy they could no longer feel. This resonance hinted at a truth none of them wished to say aloud. The planet's core had not simply been stilled. It had been stilled during the very moment of its creation. The spirals were not fractures. They were flow paths smothered in an instant. The shadow at the center was not merely darkness. It was the point where creation had halted, and the crystalline layers wrapped around it like rings of a frozen wave, each one a record of the forces that had shaped the world's birth. If the researchers wanted to understand the impossible blue, they would have to explore deeper than the crust, deeper than the spirals, deeper than the shadow. They would need to reach the moment of origin, the instant when the world turned from motion to stillness, the boundary where creation and collapse became one. And the next revelation waited in the deepest layers of all, where the oldest material pressed closest to the silent heart. The story was moving inward, and the planet was ready to reveal the next page. The deeper layers of the planet revealed themselves with a slowness that felt almost respectful, as though the world were allowing its secrets to rise to the surface one breath at a time. These inner strata were darker than the rest, not with the blue glow that defined the outer shell, but with a subdued density, a heaviness that suggested matter compressed beyond ordinary understanding. Their texture in the readings did not scatter light, did not shimmer or refract. Instead, they absorbed light just slightly, softening it the way deep water swallows the last traces of a fading sunset. It was within these layers that the researchers felt the growing presence of the shadow at the core. The boundary between matter and silence was so subtle that for a moment, the instruments could not distinguish one from the other. The crystals near the core grew thicker, folded inward, as though drawn toward the darkness not by collapse but by longing. Each fold carried a gentle curvature, resembling the inward pull of a tide that is trying to reach something hidden beneath the shore. The first measurements of density confounded every expectation. This was not rock, not crystal, not metal. It was something between states, a hybrid, form that did not adhere to any known phase of matter. It behaved neither like a solid nor a liquid. It was ordered enough to hold structure, yet restless enough to absorb and dissipate energy without cracking. It was matter in a kind of suspended intention. The planet's interior was not dead. It was waiting. The contradiction grew sharper as the scans strengthened. Normally, compression at this depth would lead to intense heat, but here, the temperature remained eerily stable, neither rising nor falling. It was as though the material had settled into an equilibrium that defied thermodynamics, a perfect, impossible calm. And in that calm, the spiraling lines from the outer layers converged like rivers feeding into a lake of darkness. The researchers watched as the spirals traced downward, each curve bending just slightly as it approached the core. None of the lines crossed into the shadow. They simply circled it, orbiting the silence like satellites around a forgotten world. The paths were too consistent to be accidental. They suggested a force that had once rotated, a motion that had once shaped the heart of the planet before being extinguished in a single, frozen instant. The moment of interruption, the instant when everything stopped, was preserved in every curve. The drift of thought carried the team back to the idea of the supernova. The planet had been forged in violence, sculpted by pressures so immense that matter behaved like fluid even as it froze. But something about these inner layers did not speak of destruction. They spoke of being held, contained, protected, as if the forming world had been wrapped around a central presence, folding itself into a shell to preserve something delicate held inside. The core's shadow refused to reveal itself. Every attempt to probe it ended in silence. Not reflective silence, but an absorbing one, as though the darkness consumed every trace of inquiry. Even gravity behaved strangely near its edge. Calculations showed a slight deviation, a tiny displacement of expected mass, as though the shadow had weight without possessing matter, presence without substance. The more the team examined it, the more the shadow resembled a void that was not empty, a stillness that was not absence, a silence that was not death. The researchers began to wonder whether the planet had formed around a fragment of something older than the supernova that birthed it, a seed left behind by a deeper catastrophe, a remnant of a collapsed order, a structure so delicate that the planet itself had become its shield, and the layers closest to the shadow grew even stranger. Their crystalline bonds were twisted just slightly, forming a pattern that resembled the slow spiral of a funnel frozen at the moment of collapse. The curvature grew tighter and tighter as it approached the darkness, as though the matter itself had been pulled inward by a force that vanished before the spiral could finish its descent. The world had been interrupted, its birth halted, its shaping cut short, and the instant of that interruption had become the defining feature of its interior. The researchers realized that to understand the core, they would need to understand what had stopped it. What force had frozen the spiraling collapse? What event had stilled the movement of matter without shattering it? What presence could quiet a forming world so completely that even its silence carried structure? They looked back up from the core, tracing the spirals outward, following the layers as they brightened into blue again. The journey told a story in reverse, from darkness to glass, from glass to glow, from glow to the shimmering surface now drifting peacefully around a quiet star. The planet was an echo frozen in 3 dimensions, yet the shadow at its center was more than an echo. It was the beginning, the thing that had come before the world itself. And if the researchers could not penetrate the shadow directly, then they would have to search for its influence in the layers beyond it, in the tidal scars, in the pressure lines, in the faintest residues of force. The answers were not in the core, they were in the shape of everything around it. And so the story moved outward again, into the patterns etched upon the world by the hand that stilled its heart. The story carried the researchers outward again, away from the silent heart, and into the bands of mineral memory that formed the planet's frozen anatomy. These layers, shaped by pressure and interrupted motion, began to reveal whispers of the forces that once sculpted the world. And it was among these layers that the first true signs of ancient anomalies appeared. It began with a peculiar distortion found deep within the crystalline strata, far from the surface but not yet touching the shadow. Under spectral analysis, the distortion looked like a ripple, an imperfection in the otherwise flawless mineral symmetry. But when magnified, the ripple broke apart into smaller components, each one bearing a signature that should not have been there. The bonds between the atoms were slightly mismatched, not randomly, not chaotically, but directionally. They twisted in one orientation only, like a faint curl frozen into the world's substance. Chirality, molecular handedness. On Earth, such asymmetry is found in biology, in chemistry, in systems where life and complexity arise from slight imbalances. But in planetary minerals shaped by stellar death, chirality should not exist. Forces that powerfully erase symmetry, they do not create delicate imbalances. The researchers held their silence as the implications spread through the room. It was not life. It was not organic. But it was a sign that the pressures shaping the mineral layers were not uniform. Something had pushed matter in one direction, not two. Something had oriented the very bonds of stone. And the deeper they looked, the more pronounced the twist became. Layer by layer, the chirality intensified. Not abruptly, but gradually, as though the planet had endured a force that strengthened over time. A force that curled the very fabric of its matter into a spiral, reflecting the motion that once existed at its center. The conflict sharpened. What kind of cosmic event leaves behind molecules that twist in only one direction? Not explosion, not collapse, not mere cooling. It would require a field, a directed, overwhelming field. A force capable of orienting the very chirality of matter during formation. But the planet's magnetic field was gone, long gone. And even at full strength, a magnetic field alone could not sculpt chirality into crystalline layers at planetary scale. Something else was involved, something not fully understood. A field that resembled magnetism, but moved deeper, quieter, through the world's early form. The drift of thought led them to the memory of the supernova that had shaped the planet. A supernova releases more than heat and light. It releases neutrinos, storms of ghost particles that stream through matter like wind through grass. Billions pass through each square inch of space every second, unnoticed, unfelt. Normally, they leave nothing behind. But in extreme environments, where pressure and temperature push matter into unstable configurations, even a subtle influence can create ripples. The idea settled in with a gentle weight. Perhaps the chirality was the fingerprint of a neutrino storm, a moment when the dying star's final breath passed through the forming planet, tilting the symmetry of its minerals, freezing the directionality into its crystalline heart. Yet something about that explanation felt incomplete. The chirality was too strong, too focused, too coherent. It was not the soft drift of trillions of particles passing without intent. It was the trace of a single moment of overwhelming order. The researchers examined the twisted bonds again, tracing their orientation as they bent toward the silent core. And then, slowly, a new thought rose between them. What if the chirality was not a product of passing neutrinos? What if it was a memory of the force that had frozen the world? A force that halted motion so abruptly that the direction of collapse was preserved in the molecular structure itself? A preserved direction, a preserved fall, a preserved moment. The closer the team studied the deepest layers, the more the chirality converged toward the central shadow. Every twist pointed inward. Every angle leaned. Every atomic imbalance was a vector aimed at a single, silent point. The shadow, not as a void, not as an absence, but as a cause. Whatever had stilled the planet had done so with a precision that echoed outward into its very structure. The mineral layers were not merely frozen, they were folded in one direction, toward the heart. And if the chirality was a memory of the planet's moment of arrest, then the shadow at the center was the origin of that moment. The place where a force had touched the planet and held it so completely that its internal spirals collapsed into stillness before they could finish forming. The world had not simply cooled, it had been stilled, and the silent core carried the imprint of that stillness, like a fossil in the dark. To understand the nature of that force, the researchers realized they would have to look at the events that occurred just before the planet froze. The final moment of motion, the last breath of heat, the instant when a world fell inward and then stopped. And that meant traveling deeper into the planet's past than any mineral layer could show. The answers were not only stored in matter, they were stored in pressure, in gravity, in the shock wave of creation itself. The next revelation lay in the moment, when the collapsing world first touched the force that would shape its destiny. a moment the planet still remembered, waiting to be uncovered. The memory of the planet's stillness lingered in its twisted crystalline bonds, but the true record of that moment lived in a place even more ancient than the minerals themselves. It lived in the faint echo of the universe's oldest light. The cosmic background radiation washed gently across everything in existence, a quiet hum left behind from the dawn of creation. Most worlds absorbed it in predictable ways, shallow and uniform. But when the researchers observed how the background glow interacted with the blue planet, something unusual stirred in the data. The planet did not simply absorb the ancient light, it responded to it. The response was subtle, barely a tremor in the readings, but unmistakably patterned. When the soft relic of the universe's beginning pressed against the crystalline layers, certain bands within the crystalline mineral crust seemed to quiver very slightly, as though the world were remembering something. The quiver was not random, it was rhythmic, a faint oscillation that rose in harmony with the chirality embedded in the deepest strata. It was as if the cosmic background radiation were tapping gently on the planet's surface, and the planet was tapping back. The researchers leaned closer to the screens as the oscillations formed into delicate waveforms across the outer shell. They resembled interference patterns, but not from present-day physics. These patterns matched models of matter interacting with energy fields that existed only in the earliest seconds after the birth of the universe, fields that no longer shape the cosmos as they once did, but whose faint echoes still drifted through space. The planet was reacting to the background hum of creation, not loudly, not obviously, but like a sleeping creature shifting slightly at the sound of a familiar lullaby. The conflict sharpened once more. Why would a world forged in the death of a star resonate with the whispers from the birth of all stars? What connection could exist between an ancient supernova and the cosmic glow of the Big Bang? The researchers examined the interference patterns again. The resonance was strongest in regions where the chirality ran deepest, where the twisted bonds leaned hardest toward the silent core. It was as if the very moment of the planet's freezing had captured a signature not only of its dying star, but of something far older, something woven into the fabric of the universe itself. The drift of thought deepened. Perhaps the planet had been shaped by more than stellar collapse. Perhaps it had been formed in a moment when the remnants of a dying star collided with the lingering structure of the early cosmos. A place where old forces brushed against newer ones. A place where matter learned to listen to ancient echoes. The researchers examined the resonance curves more closely. They did not behave like typical energy responses. Instead, they aligned with mathematical models of density fluctuations in the early universe, tiny ripples in existence that guided the formation of galaxies. These ripples no longer influenced the cosmos directly, but their patterns survived, fossilized in light itself. And yet here they were, faint but clear, imprinted across the crystalline shell of a solitary world. It was as though the planet had captured a fragment of the universe's first breath and carried it with it through time. The thought was startling in its quiet enormity. The planet was not only a relic of stellar death, it might also be a relic of cosmic birth. Its impossible blue glow, its frozen spirals, its silent core, each feature might be shaped not only by the forces of a dying star, but by the lingering geometry of the early cosmos. The world was a tapestry woven from two extremes, the last moment of a star's life and the first moments of the universe's. This duality explained the chirality, the spirals, the preservation of motion in stillness. The planet was responding to signals that should have faded long before its formation. But instead of fading, those signals had been captured and held in the crystalline heart. The researchers realized that the world was more than a fossil. It was a bridge between creation and destruction, between the first echo and the last. And the next step in understanding the planet required peeling back the resonance further, diving deeper into the patterns that linked its birth to the universe's earliest memory. If the world truly carried the imprint of those ancient ripples, then understanding them could reveal how the silent core first came to be, how the shadow was formed, how the planet crystallized around it, and why the impossible blue still glowed with quiet certainty. The next discovery waited where the resonance was, strongest in the layers just above the silent core, where the memory of creation curled closest around the darkness. The story was closing in on the moment when the world first took shape, and the planet, patient as stone, was ready to let that moment surface. The resonance with the ancient light grew stronger as the researchers shifted their focus toward the deepest layers just above the silent core. Here, the crystalline structures behaved in ways no mineral should. They did not simply hold the memory of pressure or direction. They pulsed, faintly, with a rhythm that did not belong to any known geological process. It was not heat. It was not vibration. It was something far quieter and far older, like the ghost of a sound too ancient for the universe to remember. Yet the planet remembered it. When the cosmic background radiation brushed against these layers, the crystals responded with delicate, spiraling patterns of reflection. These were not random. They matched, in faint miniature, the very ripples in the ancient light that had guided the formation of galaxies. Patterns carved not by stars, but by the fabric of the universe itself. In its earliest, most fragile moments, the researchers watched as these deep layers shimmered softly in the presence of the background hum. The spirals aligned inward, curling toward the shadow at the planet's center, like petals around a hidden bloom. It was as though the crystals were listening for something, or answering something, or remembering a moment so far back in time that no star remained to speak of it. The conflict sharpened once more. If these patterns were truly echoes of the universe's earliest structure, how had a single planet captured them? Why would the traces of the young cosmos be preserved here, in a world born from the death of a much later star? The questions trailed through the room like drifting dust. The team's instruments returned consistent results, unwavering. Even after repeated scans, the deeper the crystals lay, the more intensely they reflected the primordial patterns. It was almost as if the material itself carried an imprint of a time before the planet existed, before the star that shaped it existed, before even the dust of the galaxy had gathered into form. A thought rose slowly, quietly, as though it had been waiting in the dark. What if the matter that formed the planet had once been part of something older than stars? What if it was not simply condensed from supernova debris? What if it carried within it the remnants of a force that had touched the universe at its earliest breath? The drift of thought deepened, leading the researchers to consider a possibility almost too strange to voice. Perhaps the planet had been born not just from stellar collapse, but from a convergence, a moment when the dying energy of a star collided with the lingering structure of the early cosmos, fusing two eras of the universe into one object. A world formed at the intersection of creation's memory and destruction's aftermath. The more they examined the resonance lines, the clearer the picture became. The patterns were too organized to be accidents, too ancient to be local, too synchronized with the cosmic background radiation to have formed in isolation. It was as if the deepest layers of the planet were aligned with the universe itself, not now, but then, aligned with the shape of existence when existence was still learning how to take form. The crystals closest to the silent core pulsed again, faintly. It was not sound. It was not motion. It was a shift in the way they reflected the ancient light, a subtle tightening of the spirals that hinted at something beneath them responding in turn. The shadow at the center pressed gently against the readings, still hidden, still consuming every probe that reached for it. But for the first time, the researchers sensed that the shadow was not simply a void. It was a boundary, a threshold, a place where the deepest memories of matter converged and quieted. The planet had not merely frozen around this shadow, it had formed around it, shaped itself in spirals, aligned its chirality, preserved its impossible blue. Every layer curved inward as though paying silent homage to the presence at the center. And the presence, though silent, was not empty. It was holding something, a memory too heavy for light, a moment too deep for time. To understand the planet's impossible nature, the researchers realized they would have to look closer at the boundary itself, at the thin veil where ordered crystal met absolute stillness, where matter ended and the shadow began. Because whatever waited inside the darkness was not only the cause of the planet's frozen birth, it was the reason the world still glowed with ancient blue. And the next step required crossing as close to that boundary as their tools could reach. The planet was leading them inward, one slow layer at a time. And now, with the spirals tightening, the boundary was ready to speak in its own silent way. The boundary between crystal and shadow lay before the researchers like a soft horizon, neither sharp nor jagged, but fluid in a way that defied the stillness of the surrounding layers. It was a place where matter seemed to hesitate, where the spiraling structures of the mineral lattice curved inward and then stopped, as though unwilling to cross into the darkness. The closer their instruments drifted, the clearer it became that this edge was not just an end of material, it was a threshold, a narrow zone, where the laws governing the world began to blur. The crystals nearest to the boundary behaved in a manner unlike any other part of the planet. They shifted faintly when touched by background radiation, responding with tight, rhythmic pulses instead of the wide spirals seen in the outer layers. These pulses were almost like breathing small inhalations and exhalations of reflected light, steady and controlled, as though the crystal itself were regulating its response to the ancient hum. But within that quiet rhythm, something unexpected emerged. At certain wavelengths, the pulses did not merely reflect the background radiation, they refracted it into new patterns. The researchers leaned in as the refracted waves spread across the surface of the boundary layer, forming intricate spirals even tighter than those found in the planet's deeper layers. The patterns repeated themselves, then folded, then repeated again, creating structures that resembled a language of light. Not random, not noise, but a kind of geometric whisper. The conflict grew sharper, heavier. Crystals do not encode information. They do not transform ancient radiation into structured waves. They do not create patterns that resemble communication, unless something once acted upon them that the world had been unable to forget. The more the patterns repeated, the more they seemed like the fossilized echo of a moment when the boundary had not been quiet, a moment when something pressed against it with enough force or enough presence to shape the way the crystal reacted forever. It was as though the boundary was the imprint of a touch. The drift of thought carried the researchers into a deeper speculation. Perhaps the planet had not simply formed around a shadow. Perhaps the boundary marked the place where the shadow had stopped expanding, or where the rest of the world had stopped collapsing toward it. The refracted spirals supported that idea. They grew sharper, closest to the darkness. They curved in the same direction as the chirality embedded in the deeper layers. And as the pulses evolved, they began to show hints of symmetry so delicate that it felt almost alive. But the shadow itself did not move, did not pulse, did not respond. Or perhaps it did respond, just not in ways the instruments could measure. The only hints of its presence were the patterns that formed at its edge, the spirals that tightened, the crystals that leaned, the silence that deepened. The researchers began examining the boundary more closely, scanning it from multiple angles. They discovered something that made them stop and sit with the data in a breathless quiet. The thickness of the boundary varied, not by randomness, not by fracture or fault, but by intention. Where the spirals were strongest, the boundary was thin, as though the crystal had stretched inward as far as it dared. Where the spirals weakened, the boundary thickened, forming a protective layer between the crystal world and the shadowed heart. The boundary was not uniform, it was adaptive. It had shaped itself according to a force that had once acted on the world with overwhelming clarity. What that force was remained unclear, but its signature lay everywhere in The spirals, in the chirality, in the blue glow, in the silence. The boundary behaved less like a wall and more like a memory of the moment when the forming planet brushed against something it could not absorb, something it could not contain, something it could only hold at its center, a moment when matter touched a presence older than stars. And as the researchers watched the patterns shift and fold across the boundary layer, another realization began to rise. These refracted spirals were not merely echoes of the early universe. They were reactions to the shadow, signs that the darkness at the core had once shaped the planet not by force, but by gravity of existence, by simply being there. If they wished to understand why the planet glowed blue, why it froze in spirals, why it carried the memory of cosmic birth, they would need to understand what dwelled inside that silence. The answer did not lie in the layers around the shadow. It lay beyond them, inside them, within the threshold where matter dared not cross. And the next step meant focusing not on the crystals or the spirals, but on the shadow itself, the one place their instruments had yet to illuminate. The story was ready to move inward again, toward the heart of the silence, and the darkness, patient and ancient, waited. The darkness at the center of the world waited with a patience that felt older than the planet itself. Everything around it, every spiral, every crystalline fold, every echo of ancient light, seemed shaped in quiet orbit of this shadowed presence, as if the planet were a chrysalis formed around something it could not dissolve. But before the researchers could understand the nature of the core, they needed to understand the scars that lay above it. Scars not visible on the smooth blue surface, but etched deep into the crystalline body like the remnants of an ancient wound. The first of these scars appeared as a long, narrow distortion cutting through the inner layers. It did not break the crystalline structure, but bent it, curling the mineral bonds into a direction that differed slightly from the spirals surrounding it. The distortion did not radiate outward like a fracture. Instead, it ran in a nearly straight line, as though something once passed through the planet with enough force to leave a seam of rearranged matter in its wake. The scar did not glow. It absorbed, a thin line of softened blue where the light folded inward and quieted. As the researchers studied the scar more closely, they found that its mineral structure had melted and refrozen in a way unlike the rest of the planet. The material bore patterns consistent with rapid heating, but the heating did not come from within. It came from one direction only, as though the world had once been brushed by a burst of energy so intense that it carved a silent, perfect path into the crystalline layers. It was not heat from the planet's formation. It was not heat from the frozen core. This was a foreign wound, a mark left by an event the world had endured long after its birth. The conflict sharpened in the room. What could have scarred a planet of glass without shattering it? What kind of energy could melt mineral into liquid and then allow it to freeze again without leaving a crater or a fracture? What force could penetrate so deeply and yet leave the outer surface unmarred? The data provided a whisper of an answer. The scar aligned perfectly with the planet's ancient trajectory, the path it had taken through the debris of the supernova that birthed it. A straight line through chaos, a straight line through fire. A supernova does not explode smoothly. It bursts outward in waves, layers of energy, mass, radiation. Among these waves are narrow, momentary jets of intense heat and light, like cosmic lances fired through the dying remains of the star. One such jet could have passed through the newborn planet as it drifted away from the collapsing core. Not a direct hit such a strike would have annihilated it, but a grazing touch. A brush of stellar fire so brief that it melted only a thin seam before the world moved beyond its reach. This single, silent wound ran deeper than any layer of chirality or resonance. It preserved the angle at which the planet had escaped the heart of the dying star. It was the fossil of a moment when the world had been caught in the edge of destruction, reshaped by the breath of a collapsing sun. The drift of thought deepened as the researchers traced the scar downward. The path bent slightly as it approached the boundary of the central shadow, curving as though the molten material had been pulled inward by the presence at the core. The closer it came, the more the line twisted, following the same directional bias found in the other crystalline layers. And then, abruptly, it stopped. Not faded, not thinned, stopped. At the threshold of the shadow, the scar ended as cleanly as a line erased from a page. Whatever force shaped the shadow did not allow the wound to enter. It did not heal it. It simply refused it. The researchers stared at the data in silent awe. The core had not repelled the energy. It had not absorbed it either. It had simply remained untouched, unaffected by the scar that had melted matter across half the planet. The shadow had been there during the wound, and it had remained indifferent to it. This realization shifted the understanding of the planet's formation once more. If the scar came after the planet's birth, then the shadow had survived not just the moment of stilling, but the searing chaos of the supernova's aftermath. It had remained intact while the world around it was reshaped, melted, refrozen, carried across light years, and caught by a younger star. The shadow was not a fragile void. It was an anchor, a presence strong enough to withstand everything the universe had thrown at it. The researchers traced the end of the scar again, watching how it curled like a faint gesture, pointing toward the silence. And in that curve, another question rose from the depths of their thoughts. If the planet had endured wounds and wanderings and cosmic storms without losing the core, then what was the shadow holding? What memory? What fragment of an earlier universe? What presence could survive both birth and devastation? The scar had revealed that the shadow was untouched by destruction. The next step was to uncover what it was preserving. And so the story moved inward once more, toward the untouched silence at the center, the still point around which the world had shaped itself, layer by crystalline layer, like a guardian around a secret waiting to be spoken. The deeper the researchers followed the planet's inner history, the more they realized that the world had not simply been shaped by violence, it had been clarified by it. Every wound, every spiral, every trace of pressure or resonance had left behind not chaos, but structure, delicate, intentional, quietly coherent. And nowhere was this strange coherence more apparent than in the layers that separated the scar from the deeper crystalline folds. These transitional layers did not behave like the others. They were smoother, gentler, and strangely calm, as though the world had paused after its wound, inhaling softly before continuing its slow descent towards stillness. The minerals here glowed faintly in a different shade of blue, deeper and more subdued, like twilight reflecting off glass rather than the bright shimmer of the surface. It was as if the planet had taken a breath, a long one, a cooling, settling breath that allowed its structure to heal without erasing the memory of what had happened. The thermal signatures across these layers were remarkably uniform. No fractures, no turbulence, no lingering signs of disruption. Instead, the readings revealed a kind of alignment, a gentle smoothing of the spirals, as though the planet had softened its own wound before letting it sink into the deeper strata. This strange tranquility puzzled the team. Catastrophe leaves scars. Frozen worlds preserve shocks. Glass remembers every tremor. And yet here, in the layers between trauma and silence, the world had found a way to smooth itself, to restore a fragile equilibrium without losing the shape of its story. The conflict deepened. What force could create such gentle order after such intense disruption? Not gravity alone, not heat, not the fading remnants of a dying star. Something else had acted upon these layers, something that wrapped the planet in a momentary cradle of stillness, allowing it to reorganize, reorient, reassemble itself into the frozen beauty it carried now. The drift of thought led the researchers toward the idea that the planet's journey after the supernova had not been immediate. Perhaps the world had passed through a region of space where cooling occurred so quickly and so evenly that even molten scars refroze into smooth, coherent patterns. Perhaps the newborn planet had drifted into a pocket of cosmic cold, a region where temperatures dropped faster than motion could respond. But the more they examined the mineral alignment, the less this explanation felt complete. The cooling was not random. The patterns were not chaotic. The alignment was too precise, too synchronized with the deeper spirals that curled toward the silent core. It was not a random cryogenic moment. It was a guided release. The team considered another possibility, one spoken softly, as though the air around them needed gentleness to receive it. Maybe the planet had paused because something at its center had paused. Maybe the shadow at the core had entered a state of perfect stillness, and the world, bound to it in ways they could not yet quantify, mirrored that stillness outward, like ripples, calming around a quiet stone. The idea hung in the room like a faint echo. The planet had not healed itself. It had been calmed. Whatever lay in the core had settled into a perfect, unbroken silence. And the world had followed. This possibility reframed every layer they had seen so far. The spirals were memories of collapse. The chirality was a memory of direction. The resonance with ancient light was a memory of creation. And the smooth layers above the scar were a memory of stillness imposed by the core itself. The researchers studied the transitional band again and saw something they had missed before. Along its outer edge, the faint blue deepened into a soft violet, a hue so subtle it had been swallowed by the surrounding glow. But when isolated, it suggested a shift in energy state, one that did not belong to cooling or compression. It resembled the absorption pattern of particles that barely interact with matter, particles older than stars, particles woven into the universe's earliest fabric. It was the same faint resonance observed earlier, the one triggered by the cosmic background radiation. But here, near the wound's memory, the resonance was not passive. It was absorbed, held, folded into the structure like a faint imprint of something brushing against the planet as it cooled. The implications fell softly across their thoughts. This layer was the imprint of the moment when the world stabilized, the moment when a field stronger than heat, stronger than gravity, stronger even than collapse itself, held the planet in perfect stillness long enough for the wound to refreeze. A presence, a force, a quiet hand the universe rarely reveals. The transitional layers were not created by chaos. They were created by protection. And the next truth waited in the region beyond them, where that protective stillness first touched the forming world, where the planet had folded itself inward around the silence, and where the story of its impossible core would finally begin to speak. The path was turning inward again, toward a deeper understanding of the force that shaped the blue world. And the planet, as always, waited with gentle patience. The protective layers that encircled the deeper strata glowed with a muted calm, as though they had been shaped by a presence that did not wish to harm the planet, only to steady it. The way the minerals softened into symmetry, the way their bonds aligned with a quiet purpose, told a story that the researchers could sense more than measure. It was the story of a world that had been held in place long enough to survive a wound, long enough to find its shape again. But just beneath those tranquil layers, the pattern shifted once more. The calm did not extend all the way to the core. Something below that piece carried tension, slight, subtle, but unmistakable. It began with a faint tightening of the spirals. The crystalline structures that previously unfurled in gentle arcs now wrapped more closely together, as though responding to a deeper pull from within. These spirals did not swirl widely as in the upper layers. They coiled in narrowing curves, gradually folding into one another the closer they approached the boundary of the silent core. The effect was almost biological, like muscle fibers tightening around a hidden organ. But this was stone, cold, heavy mineral, matter frozen in a moment far older than any living memory. When the team mapped the tension across these spirals, they found that the lines converged into intricate lattices that resembled the shape of magnetic field lines, but only resembled. They did not carry magnetic force. They carried direction, the direction of a motion that once existed, flowed, strengthened, and then halted. A memory of rotation. The conflict sharpened in their minds. Magnetic motion requires heat. Heat requires movement. Movement requires a core that is alive. But this world's core was silent, utterly silent. And yet the spirals recorded a rotational memory as clearly as a fossil records the curve of an ancient seashell. The researchers traced the inward arcs again, watching how each narrowed into tighter forms until they approached the boundary only to soften, as if recognizing the silence there and refusing to go any further. What force had spun the core before it froze? What could have driven such inward motion in a planet forged in the aftermath of a star's death? And what could have stopped it so completely that only memory remained? The drift of thought carried them to the idea that the core had once held energy not of heat, but of pressure. Pressure that flowed around the shadow at the center. Pressure shaped by an object that did not behave like matter at all. Perhaps the world had not rotated around a solid core, but around a point of absolute stillness, the way water spirals around the drain it can never quite reach. But that metaphor was incomplete. Water spirals toward emptiness. These spirals leaned toward presence. The crystals were not collapsing into the shadow, they were aligning to it. The researchers studied the tension maps again. Along the inward spirals, the minerals stiffened slightly, as if bracing themselves. They were not being pulled. They were responding, tilting, leaning, orienting in a way that suggested the shadow exerted not force, but definition. It shaped the space around itself, not by movement, but by nature. The deeper they looked, the more the spirals resembled the paths of light around a gravitational lens, bent, guided, softened, but not consumed. This resemblance whispered a new, unsettling idea. What if the shadow was not a void, but a structure so dense and so compact that its influence curved matter without touching it, like gravity does at its most extreme, but quieter, subtler, almost gentle? A silent mass, a condensed fragment, a seed of something older than the star that birthed the planet. The spirals reacted as though in orbit around a point beyond measurement, as though protecting it, or being protected by it. The crystal tension increased the closer they got, building into delicate stress patterns just outside the boundary. These patterns did not break. They held with a brittle grace that suggested they had been frozen in the middle of yielding, like the last moment of motion captured forever. Matter had not simply fallen inward. It had been interrupted while falling. The researchers felt the weight of that realization settle into the room like a dimming light. Whatever force froze, the planet had acted at the exact moment when the spirals collapsed toward the core. It had stopped not just motion, but intention, an inward flow so powerful that only a presence beyond ordinary matter could arrest it. This presence had become the shadow, not absence, but containment, not void, but a sealed memory of collapse unfinished. And now the spirals whispered of the moment when everything tried to converge toward that center and was halted before reaching it. If the planet had been shaped by that moment, then everything that followed the glass, the blue glow, the crystalline calm, was the outer consequence of a single inward breath that never completed. To understand the core, the researchers would need to find the source of that breath, the force that began the collapse, the event that interrupted it, the presence that remained. And the next clues waited in the layers even closer to the boundary layers, where tension peaked, where directionality tightened, where the memory of collapse pressed hardest against the enduring silence. The planet was guiding them inward again, toward the threshold where history folded into darkness, and the silence at the center seemed to lean back, waiting. The tension in the crystalline layers grew almost imperceptibly as the researchers traced the spirals inward, each curve narrowing with a sense of purpose that felt less like collapse and more like reverence. The deeper the spirals reached toward the silent core, the more the minerals tightened, aligning in ways that suggested they were not merely recording the memory of motion, but responding to something that endured even now. It was not heat, it was not pressure, it was not movement, it was presence. The crystals closest to the boundary did not shine with the soft blue of the upper layers. They darkened into a muted indigo, a color that seemed to pull inward, as if absorbing rather than reflecting the faint light drifting through the interior. This indigo had depth, like a night sky without stars, and within it lay a faint shimmer, too subtle to see, too deliberate to ignore. The shimmer moved in tiny pulses, but not in rhythm with the thermal echoes or the ancient cosmic resonance. It was independent, a quiet flicker, repeating at an interval that did not match any natural cycle the researchers knew. It was the planet's memory of an unfinished motion. When the team magnified the pulses, the light scattered through the crystalline lattice in elegant curves, forming patterns that resembled the arcs of gravitational waves, soft, rolling distortions like the remnants of a colossal vibration frozen in place. But gravitational waves do not stop. They pass through matter, through worlds, through stars, which meant these arcs were not the waves themselves. They were the imprint of their passing. The conflict deepened. What kind of gravitational event had the strength to leave a permanent mark inside a forming planet? And what kind of event would stop in the very moment of imprinting, freezing the memory before the pattern could complete? The drift of thought pulled the researchers into the darkest corners of cosmic possibility. Perhaps the planet had been born in the path of something other than a supernova, something rarer, something so intense that matter had no choice but to shape itself around the memory of its presence. A collapsing star could leave scars, a supernova could leave spirals, but something else, something far older than collapsing stars, could leave silence. The spirals tightened again, converging toward the central shadow. The closer they came, the more the indigo deepened, until the crystals carried a near-black richness that swallowed all but the faintest strands of light. This proximity made the boundary seem less like a wall and more like a veil, thin, trembling, barely able to contain the silence it held back. The researchers watched as one spiral folded inward, pressing against the boundary with a pattern so sharp it resembled a frozen ripple. It was a snapshot of a moment when matter had tried to follow an inward pull that no longer existed. Matter had been moving toward the core, then it had stopped completely, at the same instant, in every direction. The only force capable of halting such collapse without destruction was something that acted on the structure of space-time itself. Something like the dying breath of a black hole, or the last pulse of a collapsing reality, or the faint remnant of an object so dense and so final that the universe around it had been forced into stillness. But the core was not a black hole. It had no event horizon, no gravity well, no collapse. Instead, it held silence dense, enduring, but quiet. Then a new idea rose, soft and heavy as dusk, settling on stone. What if the shadow was not the result of collapse, but the memory of one? What if the central darkness was the fossil of a gravitational event that had reached the brink of forming a singularity and then been interrupted? A collapse that had almost happened, a singularity that had almost been born, a moment when the universe itself inhaled and never exhaled. The spirals froze in that inhalation, matter bent inward by a field that no longer existed, drawn into a motion that never finished. The indigo shimmer reflected the faint echo of a gravitational scream that had not reached completion. The researchers felt a quiet chill settle into their thoughts. If the core carried the memory of a near singularity, then the planet was not only a relic of a dying star, it was the crystallized echo of a collapse that failed. Not a black hole, not a star, something in between, a collapse unconsummated. What force interrupts the birth of a singularity? What pressure halts infinite descent? What presence can quiet a law of physics mid-sentence? The answers waited deeper still, at the thin edge, where indigo crystal met absolute darkness. The boundary trembled with the faint imprint of a force that had once touched it, once shaped it, once held it in perfect stillness. And now, with the spirals tightening and the silence deepening, the next part of the story approached that trembling edge. The truth rested inside the memory of a collapse that never finished, and the presence that had stopped it. The planet, patient as always, was ready to reveal the next whisper waiting in the dark. The memory of the interrupted collapse lingered in the indigo layers like a breath caught between two worlds. Every spiral, every inward fold of crystal, every ripple of frozen vibration pointed toward the same silent truth. The planet had been shaped not by destruction, but by a moment that was never allowed to finish. A moment that pressed inward until the universe itself seemed to hold it still. If the researchers wished to understand what lived inside the shadow, they needed to follow the planet's history from the outside back to the center, from the glow of its impossible blue to the dark heart that anchored the world in unbroken silence. They began by retracing the tension patterns in the deepest crystals. These patterns did not simply curve toward the core. They recorded a faint displacement in the surrounding mineral, a subtle shift that suggested the world had once carried more mass than it did now. The difference was small, but undeniable. Something had been lost, or shed, or released, but not violently, not explosively, quietly, as though the planet had exhaled a piece of itself long ago. This loss did not create fractures. Instead, it left behind a soft realignment in the spirals, as if the world had allowed something to drift away without resistance. That realignment hinted at a moment when the planet's interior had adjusted to a new equilibrium, one that centered perfectly around the silent core. The researchers followed the signature of this release outward and found that the blue glow of the surface brightened slightly in the regions linked to the ancient adjustment. The brightness was subtle, but its implications were profound. The planet had responded to the change in its core, not with collapse, but with illumination. It had brightened, softened, stabilized. The impossible blue was not merely an optical trick. It was the residue of a rebalancing, a moment when the world embraced the stillness within it. If the shadow had once held a collapsing mass, then its interruption had become the defining event of the planet's life. The blue glow, the crystalline spirals, the frozen memory of motion, all these elements were the outward expression of an inward truth. The planet was a relic of a collapse that never completed, and it had carried that suspended moment through the galaxy like a lantern made of stone. The drift of thought carried the researchers further into the realms of possibility that brushed against the edges of known physics. They considered whether the shadow might be a fragment of the collapsing star's core, an ember smothered before it could ignite into singularity, or perhaps a piece of exotic matter condensed in the early universe, caught accidentally in the heart of the forming planet. But each theory faltered when tested. The shadow had no gravity well, no radiation, no inertia. It had presence without signature, shape without mass, an object that should not exist in this universe at all. Then one idea surfaced, gentle but immense. Perhaps the shadow was not a thing. Perhaps it was a state, a place where the rules of matter and energy had been paused, the way a single frame of a falling object can be frozen in a photograph. A fragment of space-time held in suspension, preserved inside the world that had crystallized around it, a pocket of uncompleted collapse. If such a state existed, it would not interact with matter. It would not emit energy. It would not pull or push or burn. It would simply be, and in its being, it would shape the structure around it without ever touching it. The spirals, the chirality, the indigo layers, they were all responses to the presence of a place where time itself had hesitated. The researchers felt the idea settle like a soft weight on the room. The planet was not protecting something alive. It was protecting a fragment of unfinished time. But even that explanation did not account for everything. There was still the faint outward glow, still the crystalline calm, still the lingering resonance with the ancient universe. These signs suggested something more profound. The shadow had not simply been frozen, it had been transformed. The transition layers in Chapter 16 showed that the world had paused after its wound, aligning itself in a new equilibrium. The spirals in Chapter 17 showed matter tightening toward the core in incomplete collapse. The shimmering indigo of Chapter 18 showed gravitational memory encoded in crystal. And now, in the final approach to the core, the researchers saw that all these layers pointed to a single, unspoken truth. The planet had not merely formed around the shadow. The shadow had shaped itself into the planet. Every layer was a consequence of the core's nature. Every spiral was a memory of its presence. Every pulse of blue was an echo of its quiet survival. This realization changed the question. It was no longer, what is the shadow? It became, what did the shadow do to the world that carries it? The answer lay just beyond the final indigo layers, at the threshold where matter touched silence, where the stilling force had left its deepest imprint. The story was now poised at the edge of revelation, and the next breath, the final one, would carry the researchers into the quiet heart of the world, where the last secret waited in the dark. The threshold lay before them like the edge of a thought the universe had never finished. The last indigo layers tightened into a thin, trembling veil, a boundary neither solid nor void, shimmering as though caught between breath and silence. Beyond it, the shadow waited, not with threat, not with weight, but with the quiet certainty of something that had learned how to endure without being seen. The researchers approached the boundary slowly, almost reverently. Every instrument, every scan, every reading softened into murmurs as they neared the silent heart. At this depth, the blue glow of the upper world had faded entirely. Only the faintest reflection of ancient light remained, trembling through the crystalline lattice like the last echo of a lullaby sung at the beginning of the universe. And then, gently, they reached the edge. The veil responded not with movement, but with a soft ripple, as though acknowledging a presence without resisting it. The ripple spread outward, tracing the spirals one final time, illuminating the memory of collapse, the memory of stillness, the memory of a force that had cupped the forming world in its invisible hand. The shadow did not emerge. It did not reveal itself. But the way the veil trembled told a story older than matter. There had been a moment, a single, impossible moment, when the universe had tried to create a singularity inside a collapsing star. A moment when gravity tightened, when matter folded inward, when time leaned toward its own vanishing point. But something stopped it. Something paused the collapse. Something held the singularity in suspension without allowing it to be born. The planet had formed around that hesitation, crystallizing in the presence of a fragment of unfinished time. Every layer was a hymn to that moment. Every spiral was a tribute to the inward breath that never completed. Every pulse of blue light was the faint glow of a world built around the memory of almost. And now, at the threshold, the researchers understood why the world had remained silent, why it carried the impossible blue, why it resonated with the echoes of creation. The shadow was not a remnant of matter, it was a remnant of intention, a place where the universe had once tried to change itself only to be stopped by a quiet, inscrutable force. The planet had kept that moment safe because nothing else could. The researchers felt their questions quieting, not answered, not erased, but softened, the way waves soften when they reach a shore that has been waiting for them. Some secrets are not given, they are simply held. And this world had held its secret for longer than its star, longer than its journey through the galaxy, longer than the generations of dust that drifted past its glowing shell. The veil pulsed once more, faintly, like the slow blink of a creature deep in sleep. It pulsed again, softer, then again, fading gently into stillness. The shadow at the center did nothing. It remained entire, silent, patient, as though whispering that some truths do not need discovery to be real. Above the core, the spirals relaxed, the indigo layers quieted, the calming bands softened. The blue glow waited at the surface, steady and serene, as if the planet itself were breathing in the deep, unhurried rhythm of something that had learned its purpose long ago. And in that moment, the researchers felt a strange comfort settle over them, not understanding, but acceptance, a gentle knowing that the universe, too, keeps its memories in ways beyond comprehension. The planet was not a mystery to be solved, but a moment to be witnessed, a frozen breath of creation held inside glass and silence. A world shaped not by heat or motion or collapse, but by the quiet force that stops a falling star, a world that glows blue because it remembers. And as the researchers let their thoughts drift outward past the spirals, past the crystalline waves, past the softly glowing shell, they sensed the vastness of the galaxy waiting in its patient darkness. Sometimes the universe speaks in fire. Sometimes it speaks in silence. Sometimes it speaks in a blue that should not exist. Close your eyes now. The planet is still glowing, and the universe is still turning.